7. U.S. Air Mobile Forces chopper in on a search and destroy mission against communist insurgents. Afghanistan, 1985. Mujahideen fighters fire a missile to bring down a Soviet gunship. Guerrilla conflict is not a new form of warfare, but it underlies most wars in the modern world. And with it comes the type of warfare specially designed to confront and overcome it: counterinsurgency. Both are deadly, both are brutal. And the wars of the 21st century suggest these strategies will be used as frequently in the future as they have been in the past. The battle plan is guerrilla warfare. Vietnam, 1962 to 1975. The country is divided into North and South. North Vietnamese Communist General Vo Nguyen Giap needs a strategy to unite the country under the communist flag. In the South, U.S. General William Westmoreland faces the challenge of opposing Giap and stopping the spread of communism. Afghanistan, 1979 to 1989. Soviet troops invade and occupy the country. Afghan resistance forces unite to drive them out. Soviet General Viktor Paputin oversees the first moves in the Soviet takeover of the country. In the mountains of Afghanistan, the tribal leaders and commanders of the resistance forces, which become known as the Mujahideen, plan the guerrilla campaign which will oppose Soviet occupation. Behind the scenes of both wars, the Soviet Union and the United States are engaged in a massive military technological race. Both have stockpiles of modern weapons and the capacity to destroy each other many times over. But in both Vietnam and Afghanistan, U.S. and Soviet generals like Westmoreland and Paputin will be forced to use not conventional modern military tactics, but a battle plan which has existed for thousands of years.
Guerrilla warfare is one of the oldest forms of warfare because it pits the strategically weak against the strategically strong, and because it's based upon ambush, gives the weak a chance of succeeding, gaining a military victory.
In the 20th century, guerrilla warfare is not a special case, it's the norm.
The reason for this, quite simply, is that very few of the states or organizations that are inclined to fight have the means to wage modern conventional warfare.
During the Cold War, many regional wars were supported directly or indirectly by the United States and the Soviet Union. But in Vietnam and Afghanistan, the U.S. and the Soviet Union are directly involved. And their commanders, like the leaders they oppose, will have to meet the same requirements in the battle plan for guerrilla warfare as those whose campaigns have long been consigned to the history books. Objective. Commanders starting a guerrilla war, and those opposing it, must be clear and specific in their political and military objectives. Civil support. Both sets of commanders must seek to win the support of the civilian population in the areas in which they are fighting the war. Build up. Both sides must build up their armies. In the case of the insurgents, this includes both a military and a political civilian wing. Attrition. Both sides must execute what military theorists call the attritional stage of the campaign, trying to wear down the other side. Transition. Commanders must then escalate the war from guerrilla hit and run to large-scale conventional warfare. Takeover. The insurgents must seek the takeover of government and the reins of power. The counterinsurgents must seek the destruction of the guerrilla campaign and the philosophy on which it's based. In the second half of the 20th century, with the whole political shape of the world changing, the requirement to seize the reins of power or to destroy the guerrilla's philosophy has been particularly important. Guatemala, El Salvador, Nicaragua, Colombia, Peru, Cuba, Bolivia, Algeria, Nigeria, Angola, Chechnya, Rhodesia, Mozambique, Sri Lanka, Malaya. The list goes on. But all start with the first requirement in the battle plan for guerrilla warfare. Objective. Both sets of commanders, those starting a guerrilla war and those opposing it, must be clear and specific in their objectives. The objectives must not simply be short-term and military. They must also include a long-term political goal. Vietnam, 1961. The first American military advisors are sent in by U.S. President John F. Kennedy. Their objective is to support the government of South Vietnam in its struggle against the Communist North. But guerrilla warfare in Vietnam began many years before. Ever since the end of World War II in 1945, the communist-led Viet Minh had been waging a guerrilla war against the French. Their objective was throw the French out, unite Vietnam as one country, and set up a communist state. And their battle plan for guerrilla warfare is already a proven strategy. In 1954, the Viet Minh, under General Vo Nguyen Giap, had annihilated the French at the siege of Dien Bien Phu. At the Geneva Peace Conference, held at the same time, French Indochina was divided. In the west, Laos and Cambodia became individual kingdoms. The northeast became the communist-led Democratic Republic of North Vietnam. And the southeast became the Republic of Vietnam. Incursion into the south by the North Vietnamese begins almost immediately. When the French leave, the United States lends its support to the South Vietnamese government in Saigon. But that support is quickly escalating into war. To fight that war, commanders on both sides need clarity of objective. In Vietnam, for Communist General Vo Nguyen Giap, the enemy is new, but the objective remains the same. Throw out what he sees as foreign invaders and unite the country under the communist flag. For his opponents, the situation is more complicated.
The difficulty was for the French, they couldn't keep the communism plague, as the French called it, just to the north. It was spreading further to the south. The Americans were not very keen for that to happen, and so they got increasingly involved, and by the early 1960s were really fully committed.
This is an American military training film about counterinsurgency, made in the early 1960s. Even as they are taking the first steps which will lead them into the Vietnam War, American commanders are aware of the type of warfare they face. In 1964, a new American commander arrives in Vietnam, General William Westmoreland. His objective is clear: defeat the insurgency. Now he must put the forces in place to execute the next stages of the U.S. battle plan. Vietnam, 1964. The new U.S. commander, General William Westmoreland, has a clear objective: locate the insurgents and destroy them with superior firepower. Against Westmoreland, North Vietnamese General Vo Nguyen Giap also has a clear objective: to use all the means at his disposal to force the Americans out. Thus in Vietnam, Giap and his political masters, and Westmoreland and his political masters, both have clear, immediate military objectives. In the political arena, Hanoi has a long-term goal: to unify the country. Washington's ultimate political objective in Vietnam is less certain. In the Soviet war in Afghanistan, both sides also have clear military objectives. Afghanistan has long been strategically important. It's one of the crossroads of the world. In 1979, the Soviets, concerned about internal Afghan politics, send in advisors to support government forces. By the end of the year, that support is changing to a full-scale military presence. The Soviet objective is clear.
The Soviets really wish to take this area, to link their own country to the Middle East, to actually have a view over the Middle East, and no doubt also perhaps control some of the oil production there. For them, it was therefore the expansion of the Soviet Empire.
But in the mountains of Afghanistan, the Soviet presence immediately triggers a clear objective for the tribal leaders and warlords who oppose the Soviets. Resist the invader. Throw the invader out of their country. So all the commanders in both wars have clear military objectives. Both the Soviets in Afghanistan and the Communists in Vietnam also have long-term political goals. But the long-term U.S. objective in Vietnam, after it defeats the insurgency, is vague.